Four-star General Marcus Washington stood handcuffed in an Alabama administrative building, publicly humiliated by Officer Rebecca Miller, who refused to believe his identity. Despite showing military ID, the white officer smirked. General Washington remained composed as he made one phone call. Seconds later, military vehicles surrounded the building. Officer Miller's smile vanished. Before we dive into this incredible true story of prejudice and dignity, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Hit that like button if you've ever witnessed someone being unfairly judged, and subscribe to join our community fighting against discrimination. What would you do if you were in General Washington's position? Let's find out how this remarkable story unfolds. The morning had begun like any other for General Marcus Washington. The sun stretched its golden fingers across his meticulously organized bedroom as he rose at precisely 5:30, a habit ingrained through 35 years of distinguished military service. His uniform hung perfectly pressed in his closet, 4 stars gleaming on each shoulder board, representing decades of sacrifice, leadership, and unwavering dedication to his country. As he dressed, his fingers traced over the numerous medals adorning his chest: the Distinguished Service Cross, Silver Star, Legion of Merit, and dozens more that told the story of a man who had repeatedly risked his life for American freedom. Marcus came from a family of military excellence. His grandfather had served as one of the respected Tuskegee Airmen during World War II, breaking color barriers in the sky, while his father had earned a Purple Heart in Vietnam. Service ran in his blood, commitment flowed through his veins, and love for country beat within his heart. Today's mission seemed simple compared to commanding troops in combat zones. He would be stopping at the Alabama State Administrative Center to file paperwork for a new veterans initiative before heading to a high-level meeting about expanding support programs for returning soldiers. The initiative was his passion project, creating pathways for veterans to receive educational opportunities, housing assistance, and mental health support without bureaucratic hurdles. As he adjusted his tie in the mirror, General Washington performed another daily ritual, one not taught in military academies or outlined in any official protocol. He mentally prepared himself for the possibility of discrimination. Despite his rank, accomplishments, and lifetime of service, experience had taught him that 4 stars on his shoulders didn't always shield him from prejudice. He rehearsed responses to potential slights, reminding himself that his composure represented not just himself, but generations of black service members who had fought for respect both abroad and at home. Dignity above all, he whispered to himself, a personal mantra passed down from his grandfather. The administrative center was an imposing limestone building in downtown Montgomery, its pillared entrance designed to evoke authority and permanence. As General Washington pulled his official car into the reserved section of the parking lot, he noticed Officer Rebecca Miller watching him from her security post. Her eyes narrowed as he emerged from the vehicle in full uniform, her hand instinctively moving to rest on her holster, a subtle but familiar gesture that spoke volumes. Walking with the straight-backed confidence that had carried him through war zones, General Washington nodded respectfully to the security officer as he approached the entrance. "Parking in this section requires proper authorization, officer," Miller stated flatly, ignoring the military plates on his vehicle and the rank clearly visible on his uniform. "I'm here on official business regarding the Veterans Support Initiative," General Washington explained calmly, presenting his military identification. Officer Miller scrutinized the ID card with exaggerated thoroughness, holding it up to the light as though suspicious of forgery. "These look pretty real," she said, her tone implying the opposite. "You'll need to check in at the main security desk regardless." Inside, the pattern continued. While other visitors, primarily white, were greeted with smiles and minimal scrutiny, General Washington found himself directed to secondary screening, his credentials questioned at every checkpoint. He noticed Officer Miller following at a distance, watching his movements through the building with unwarranted suspicion. The executive assistant at the permit office did a double take when he entered, her expression shifting from professional courtesy to confusion. "Are you sure you're in the right department?" she asked, despite the clearly marked sign indicating Veterans Affairs permits on the door behind her. Throughout these interactions, General Washington maintained his professional demeanor, understanding that each microaggression was sadly familiar territory. What he couldn't know was how quickly this routine discrimination would escalate into a public humiliation that would test his composure to its limits and ultimately spark a reckoning that would reverberate far beyond the walls of this administrative building. The permit office buzzed with quiet efficiency, keyboards clicking, papers shuffling, and the low murmur of administrative work in progress. General Washington approached the main desk, paperwork for his Veterans Initiative organized in a leather portfolio. Before he could speak, Officer Miller appeared at his side, her presence unexpected in this department. "Sir, I need to see your identification again," she demanded loudly, drawing attention from everyone in the room. The conversation stopped. The clicking paused. All eyes turned toward them. "I've already presented my identification at 3 checkpoints," General Washington responded evenly, his deep voice controlled despite the growing knot of frustration in his chest. "Nevertheless, I'm happy to comply." He reached for his wallet and once again produced his military ID along with his driver's license. Simultaneously, a white civilian in business casual attire entered the permit office, nodded casually to Officer Miller, and proceeded directly to a service window without being asked for any identification. The contrast was stark and unmistakable. Officer Miller barely glanced at the white visitor while subjecting General Washington's credentials to extraordinary scrutiny. "This says General Marcus Washington," she said slowly, as if reading a foreign language. "Four-star general, really?" Her tone dripped with skepticism. "That is correct," General Washington confirmed. "I'm here to file paperwork for the Southeast Veterans Support Initiative. I have an appointment with Director Harmon. Anyone can print fancy business cards or fake IDs these days," Officer Miller countered, her voice rising just enough to ensure others could hear. "I'm going to need to see additional verification." General Washington maintained his composure, though the veins in his temples pulsed visibly. "Officer Miller, I've provided standard identification, which has been accepted at every other security checkpoint. May I ask what additional verification you require that isn't being asked of other visitors?" The question hung in the air, its implication clear to everyone in the suddenly silent room. Officer Miller's face flushed. "Are you accusing me of something?" she demanded, her hand moving to her radio. "I'm simply doing my job, ensuring the security of this building. Your attitude is becoming problematic." "I've been nothing but cooperative and professional," General Washington stated, calmly. "I would like to speak with your supervisor." This reasonable request seemed to trigger something in Officer Miller. She keyed her radio and spoke with urgent authority. "This is Officer Miller in permits. I need backup for an uncooperative individual claiming military credentials, possible forgery situation." Within minutes, 3 additional security officers arrived, hands hovering near their weapons. The permit office had now transformed into a tense standoff with civilian employees pressing themselves against walls to distance themselves from the unfolding scene. "Sir, place your hands where we can see them," instructed the ranking officer among the new arrivals. General Washington complied immediately, his military training kicking in automatically. "Officers, there seems to be a misunderstanding. I am General Marcus Washington, here on official business regarding veterans support programs." "He's claiming to be a 4-star general," Officer Miller interjected before he could continue. "No proper clearance for today's visit registered with security." This was patently false. General Washington had followed all protocols, submitting his information days in advance. "That's incorrect," he stated firmly. "My visit was cleared through Director Harmon's office last week." "If you check the system—" "Enough," Officer Miller interrupted. "We're going to need to verify your identity in a secure location. Please come with us." As General Washington reached slowly for his phone, saying, "Let me contact my aide who can confirm," Officer Miller shouted, "He's reaching! Secure him now!" The response was immediate and excessive. 2 officers grabbed General Washington's arms, while another twisted the phone from his grasp. Within seconds, a decorated 4-star general, a man who had commanded thousands of troops and coordinated international military operations, was being physically restrained in a public government building for the crime of being black in a position of authority. The Veterans Initiative paperwork scattered across the floor as he was pulled away from the desk. General Washington offered no resistance, understanding that in this moment any movement could be misinterpreted with potentially deadly consequences. As handcuffs were being applied, Director Harmon himself emerged from an office drawn by the commotion. "What's happening here?" he demanded, then froze when he saw the scene unfolding. "Officers, why are you restraining this man?" "Potential." "Security threat," Officer Miller responded automatically. "Claiming false credentials." Director Harmon's face registered shock. "That's General Washington. I have a scheduled appointment with him this morning regarding the Veterans Program." But the damage was done. The handcuffs clicked shut around the wrists that had received the Presidential Medal of Freedom just 3 months prior. What followed would shock the nation, challenge an entire system, and forever change how one woman viewed the world and her place within it. The fluorescent lights of the administrative building seemed to grow harsher as General Washington was marched through the main atrium in handcuffs, Officer Miller leading the procession with a self-satisfied expression that betrayed her triumph. "Walking tall now, aren't we, General?" she muttered, just loud enough for him to hear the quotation marks around his rank audibly present in her mocking tone. The lunchtime crowd had just begun filling the space, government employees and civilians alike, stopping mid-conversation to witness the spectacle of a black man in full military dress uniform, stars, medals and all, being treated like a common criminal. Phones emerged from pockets, capturing video that would soon circulate across social media platforms and national news outlets. "We've got an identity thief here," Officer Miller announced loudly to a curious onlooker who dared to question the scene, trying to pass himself off as military brass. Can you believe the nerve? Even went to the trouble of getting a custom uniform made. The humiliation was calculated and public, designed to strip away dignity layer by layer. General Washington kept his eyes forward, his expression neutral despite the burning in his chest. Decades of military discipline held his tongue, even as Officer Miller continued her commentary. "See this kind of thing all the time," she said to another officer within Washington's earshot. "They think putting on a fancy uniform entitles them to special treatment, probably trying to access restricted areas or sensitive information." A small crowd of administrative workers had formed a gauntlet of stares and whispers. Among them, an elderly white man wearing a Korean War veteran's cap looked on with growing distress, his weathered face registering something between confusion and outrage. "Son," he called out to General Washington, "what unit did you serve with?" Before the general could answer, Officer Miller stepped between them. "Sir, please don't engage with the suspect. This is a security matter." "I served with the 3rd Infantry Division in Korea," General Washington responded anyway, his voice steady and respectful. "Later commanded the 82nd Airborne, then Joint Special Operations Command before my Pentagon appointment." The elderly veteran's eyes widened in recognition of units and positions that no civilian impersonator would likely know or claim. His mouth opened to speak, but Officer Miller was already moving General Washington along, away from potential allies. They reached the security office, a glass-enclosed space visible from the main atrium, ensuring the continued public nature of the general's degradation. Inside, Officer Miller directed him to a metal chair bolted to the floor, the kind reserved for processing criminals. "Comfortable, Lisa?" she asked with exaggerated deference. "Now let's go through your personal effects and see what other fairy tales you're carrying around." She emptied his wallet onto the desk, picking through military IDs, government clearance cards, and family photos with theatrical skepticism. "Creative forgeries," she commented, holding up his Pentagon access card. "Technology these days makes it too easy for you people to create convincing fakes. The racial undertone of you people hung in the air like poison gas." Another officer entered with an evidence bag containing the general's phone, keys, and the scattered paperwork from the Veterans Initiative. "Found these at the scene," he said, then lowered his voice to add, "Miller, Director Harmon is raising hell out there, says this guy really is expected today. Harmon's been fooled, Officer Miller dismissed. Probably used some fake letterhead to set up the appointment. We're doing a full verification before releasing him. She turned back to General Washington with a clipboard. So, General, let's start with your real name and what you hope to accomplish with this little charade. The office door opened again, and a young administrative assistant entered, visibly uncomfortable. Officer Miller, Director Harmon insists that you contact him immediately regarding this situation. He's quite upset. Tell Harmon we're following security protocols, and I'll brief him when the investigation is complete, Miller replied without looking up. After the assistant left, she continued her interrogation. 4-star general. Really? Do you know how many black 4-star generals there have been in U.S. history? Not many. The statistical probability of you actually being one is pretty much zero. Throughout this barrage, General Washington maintained his composure, responding only with, "I'd like to make my phone call now, as is my right." Officer Miller laughed. "You watch too many police shows. This isn't an arrest yet. This is a security detention during an active investigation." "Nevertheless," the general insisted calmly, "I am being held against my will, and I have the right to notify someone of my situation. I believe that right extends to security detentions, as well as formal arrests." His knowledge of legal procedure momentarily unsettled Officer Miller. She glanced at her colleague, who shrugged uncomfortably. "Fine," she relented. "One call. But it stays on speaker, and if you try to call some accomplice to create a distraction, we'll add conspiracy charges." She placed his phone on the desk and dialed it to speaker mode. "Who will it be? Your lawyer? Family member coming to bail you out?" General Washington looked directly into Officer Miller's eyes as he stated a number from memory. "Central Pentagon Command, Office of the Joint Chiefs, please." The smirk on Officer Miller's face froze, then slowly morphed into uncertainty as she recognized the legitimacy of the number on her phone's display. A professional voice answered, "Joint Chiefs Office. How may I direct your call?" "This is General Marcus Washington," he stated clearly. "Authorization code Sierra Tango 947. I need to speak with General Blackburn immediately regarding a security situation in Montgomery." The voice on the other end shifted instantly from professional to urgent. "Yes, sir, General Washington. Verifying your code now. One moment while I connect you." Officer Miller's face had drained of color. Her colleague took a small step back from the desk, suddenly very interested in the ceiling tiles. Seconds passed in tense silence before a new voice came through the speaker. "Marcus, is that you? What's happening?" "James," General Washington replied with remarkable calm, "I find myself detained at the Alabama State Administrative Center by security personnel who believe I'm impersonating a military officer. I would appreciate some verification assistance." "What?" The voice was thunderous even through the small phone speaker. "Who's responsible for this? Put them on immediately." Officer Miller had begun backing toward the door, but General Washington gestured toward the phone. "I believe you're being addressed, Officer Miller. Have you ever witnessed someone facing discrimination while maintaining their dignity? Comment number 1, if you believe General Washington's approach of calm strength is more powerful than angry confrontation. Like this video if you've ever been misjudged based on your appearance, and subscribe to see more stories of justice prevailing against prejudice. What do you think will happen when the Pentagon officials realize a 4-star general has been handcuffed and humiliated? Will Officer Miller face consequences for her actions, or will she find a way to justify her behavior? Stay tuned as we watch the power dynamics completely transform in the next part of this extraordinary true story. The security office had transformed into a pressure cooker of tension, with Officer Miller's previously confident demeanor crumbling by the second as General Blackburn's voice thundered through the phone speaker. "I want to speak to whoever is in charge there right now," demanded the voice from the Pentagon. Officer Miller froze, her hand still on the doorknob as though contemplating escape. Her colleague nudged her forward with a panicked expression. Swallowing hard, she approached the phone. "This is Officer Rebecca Miller, sir. I'm handling a security situation involving someone claiming military credentials that appeared suspicious." "Officer Miller," General Blackburn's voice dropped to a dangerous calm. The man you are currently detaining is 4-star General Marcus Washington, Deputy Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, recipient of the Distinguished Service Cross, and my personal friend for 20 years. I suggest you remove his handcuffs immediately and begin drafting your letter of resignation." Officer Miller's face flushed crimson. "Sir, we have protocols for verifying identity. This individual presented documentation that triggered security concerns and—" "What security concerns?" Blackburn interrupted. "That his skin color doesn't match your preconception of what a general looks like." The accusation hung in the air like a live grenade. Officer Miller stammered, "That's absolutely not. We would never. There was no proper advance notification." "I'm looking at the security clearance submission right now." Blackburn cut in again. "Filed electronically 7 days ago, approved 5 days ago, confirmation sent to your department. Director Harmon personally acknowledged receipt. What exactly did you miss?" The other security officer had already begun unlocking General Washington's handcuffs, murmuring apologies with each movement. Through all this, Washington remained perfectly still, his expression unreadable. When his wrists were finally free, he simply rubbed them gently without comment. "General Washington," Blackburn continued, "do you require medical attention?" "Negative," Washington replied. "No physical harm done." The emphasis on physical was subtle but unmistakable. "Understood. The Alabama governor has been notified, as has the Secretary of Defense. A military police escort is en route to your location, ETA 3 minutes. Would you like me to stay on the line?" "That won't be necessary, James. Thank you for your assistance." "Of course, Marcus. We'll debrief later." The call ended, leaving the security office in suffocating silence. Outside the glass walls, a crowd had gathered, their expressions a mixture of confusion and concern. Director Harmon could be seen pushing his way through, his face a mask of panic. General Washington straightened his uniform with methodical precision, then turned to Officer Miller. "My personal effects, please." His voice betrayed no anger, no triumph, no emotion whatsoever. It was the controlled neutrality of a man who had faced discrimination repeatedly throughout his life and career, a man who had learned that displays of justifiable anger would only reinforce the stereotypes used against him. Officer Miller moved robotically to gather his belongings, her hands trembling slightly as she returned his wallet, phone, keys, and the now crumpled Veterans Initiative paperwork. "General, she began, but he raised a hand to silence her. "Not now, Officer Miller. I believe we both have more pressing matters to attend to." The door burst open as Director Harmon entered, breathless and disheveled. "General Washington, I cannot begin to express how deeply sorry I am for this inexcusable situation. If there's anything—" "My paperwork," Washington interrupted calmly. "The Veterans Initiative still needs proper filing. Thousands of former service members are waiting on these programs, Director Harmon. Their needs don't pause for incidents like this." The director blinked, momentarily thrown by Washington's focus on the mission rather than the outrage. "Yes, of course. I'll personally expedite everything immediately." In the distance, sirens wailed, growing louder by the second. Officer Miller's complexion had gone from crimson to ashen. "Am I being arrested?" she whispered to her colleague, who could only shrug helplessly. "That will depend on several factors," General Washington answered, though the question hadn't been directed at him, "including how the investigation unfolds and what it reveals about today's events." He straightened his tie and added, "and whether this incident reflects a personal failing or a systemic one." The sounds of vehicles screeching to a halt outside the building filtered through the walls. Heavy boots pounded on marble floors, moving with military precision toward their location. Officer Miller sank into a chair, the full weight of her actions finally settling on her shoulders. The glass door opened once more, revealing a sharp-dressed aide in military uniform. "General Washington, sir. Your escort has arrived. The governor is on standby for your call, as is the Secretary of Defense. Military police are securing the premises." Washington nodded. "Thank you, Lieutenant." He turned back to face Officer Miller, who couldn't meet his gaze. "Officer Miller," he said, his voice level but penetrating, "today you made assumptions based on appearance rather than facts. You chose to believe what you expected to see rather than what was actually before. That choice has consequences, not just for you, but for everyone who witnessed it. He paused, letting his words sink in. The question now is whether you'll learn from those consequences. With that, he turned and walked out, his back straight, his head high, not as a man escaping humiliation, but as a leader moving purposefully toward his next objective. Behind him, Officer Miller buried her face in her hands as military police entered the room, their expressions grim. Outside in the atrium, applause spontaneously erupted from those who had witnessed the general's dignified exit. The elderly Korean War veteran saluted sharply as Washington passed. Director Harmon scurried alongside, still apologizing profusely. But General Washington's mind had already shifted to the veterans' initiative, to the men and women of all races who had served their country and now needed support systems that worked without bias or barrier. He would use this incident, yes, but not for personal vindication. He would transform it into something that created lasting change. The breaking point had come and gone, but what followed would be something much more powerful than mere retribution. It would be transformation. The atmosphere in the Alabama State Administrative Center transformed with breathtaking speed. The building that had moments ago been the site of blatant discrimination now hummed with urgent activity as personnel from multiple agencies converged on the scene. Military police in crisp uniforms established a perimeter around the main entrance, while plainclothes federal agents conducted preliminary interviews with witnesses. State troopers arrived minutes later, followed by representatives from the governor's office. The command structure that had allowed Officer Miller's unchecked authority was suddenly submerged beneath waves of higher jurisdictions. General Washington stood calmly at the center of this storm, reviewing his Veterans Initiative documents with Director Harmon in a hastily offered conference room while his military aide coordinated communications with Washington, D.C. security. Footage from throughout the building was being collected, witness statements recorded, and an incident timeline established with military efficiency. Outside the building, media vans began arriving, their satellite dishes extending skyward like mechanical flowers seeking sunlight. Word had spread rapidly. A black four-star general racially profiled and handcuffed in a government building made for explosive headlines. In the security office, now repurposed as an interim investigation center, Officer Miller sat rigidly in the same chair where she had placed General Washington. Two military police officers stood nearby, their presence a silent reminder of her reversed circumstances. A JAG Corps attorney sat across from her, methodically reviewing the events of the morning. "Let's be absolutely clear about the sequence," the attorney said. "You observed General Washington enter the building at approximately 30 hours. Despite his proper military identification, uniform and pre-approved security clearance, you followed him through multiple checkpoints, questioning his credentials repeatedly. Is this correct?" Officer Miller shifted uncomfortably. "I was performing standard security protocols for unverified visitors." The attorney raised an eyebrow. "Unverified? I have the electronic security clearance with your department's acknowledgement signature right here, dated 5 days ago." "I wasn't personally notified," Miller responded defensively. "There are dozens of visitors daily. I can't be expected to memorize every name. Yet you specifically targeted General Washington for extraordinary scrutiny. Can you explain why his presence triggered your suspicion when other visitors received standard processing?" Miller's silence spoke volumes. In the atrium, the crowd had grown as administrative workers, delayed by the lockdown procedures, gathered in clusters discussing the morning's events. "I always knew something like this would happen eventually," one black administrative assistant said to her colleagues. "Miller's been profiling people for years. Remember when she detained that Hispanic federal judge last month?" Her white co-worker nodded. "She made my Kenyan husband wait 2 hours for a visitor's pass, while a white contractor walked right through with barely a glance at his ID." These conversations multiplied throughout the building, years of observed bias suddenly finding voice, now that Miller's power had been neutralized. On the third floor, the governor's chief of staff arrived breathless, having rushed from the Capitol, building 3 blocks away. "Where is General Washington?" he demanded of a military aide. "The governor is on his way personally. This is a disaster of the highest order." The general is currently focused on completing his original mission. Regarding veterans' services, the aide replied coolly, he's asked not to be disturbed for non-essential matters until the paperwork is properly processed. The chief of staff blinked in disbelief. Non-essential? This is a political and public relations crisis. The governor needs to make a public statement with the general at his side immediately. The aide's expression remained neutral. I'll convey your request, but General Washington's priority remains the veterans' initiative that brought him here initially. He's been quite clear about that. This exchange illustrated the extraordinary shift occurring throughout the building. Political considerations that would normally take precedence were suddenly secondary to the general's mission. Power structures that had seemed immutable that morning were being reorganized around the quiet authority of a man who had been in handcuffs just 30 minutes earlier. In the conference room, General Washington finished reviewing the amended paperwork with Director Harmon. These changes will streamline the application process for homeless veterans, he explained, pointing to a modified form. Many don't have permanent addresses or standard identification, but their service can be verified through military records. This accommodation ensures they won't face additional barriers. Director Harmon nodded eagerly, taking detailed notes, and obviously grateful for the opportunity to demonstrate his cooperation. The contrast between Washington's treatment of Harmon and Miller's treatment of Washington earlier couldn't have been more stark. Where she had wielded authority with contempt, he exercised power with purpose and respect. A knock at the door announced the arrival of the building's head of security, a middle-aged man whose complexion had gone sickly pale. General Washington, sir. I've just been briefed on the incident. As head of security, the behavior of all officers falls under my responsibility. I want to personally apologize and assure you that— Mr. Daniels, is it? Washington interrupted, reading the man's identification badge. Yes, sir. Mr. Daniels, I appreciate your taking responsibility. That's the first step toward meaningful change. The second is accurate information. I understand you've been collecting witness statements and security footage. Yes, sir. We have comprehensive camera coverage throughout the building. Excellent. I'd like all of that material preserved, and copies provided to my office, the Governor, and the Department of Defense Civil Rights Division by end of day. The security chief swallowed hard. Of course, sir. Additionally, Washington continued, I'd like access to all complaints filed regarding potential racial profiling or discrimination by security personnel in this building for the past 5 years. All complaints, sir. The chief's voice had risen an octave. That would be quite voluminous and would require approval from several departments for release. Washington's expression remained pleasant, but his eyes hardened slightly. I believe those approvals will be forthcoming given the circumstances. Don't you agree, Director Harmon? Harmon, eager to demonstrate his support, nodded vigorously. Absolutely, General. I'll sign off immediately and ensure the other department heads do the same. Outside the conference room, the hallway had filled with officials from various agencies, all waiting for an audience with General Washington. Military aides controlled access, creating a makeshift receiving line that emphasized Washington's newfound position at the center of authority. When a state senator arrived and attempted to bypass the line, he was politely but firmly directed to wait his turn, regardless of his political standing. The power dynamics had completely inverted. The man who had been handcuffed and humiliated now controlled the building's operational tempo. Those who had stood by during his mistreatment now eagerly awaited his attention. And Officer Miller, who had wielded her authority like a weapon, now sat isolated and diminished, watching her career and reputation disintegrate with each passing minute. The transformation was as swift as it was complete, a living demonstration of how quickly unearned authority crumbles when confronted with genuine leadership and moral standing. As the afternoon progressed, one thing became increasingly clear to everyone in the building. What had begun as a shameful episode of racial profiling was evolving into something much more significant, a catalyst for systemic change that would extend far beyond one officer's bias or one general's vindication. The administrative building's largest conference room had been hastily converted into an incident command center, with representatives from military, state, and federal agencies gathered around a massive oak table. At the head sat General Washington, his composure unshaken despite the morning's events. To his right, the governor of Alabama, who had arrived with a police escort and a phalanx of aides, listened intently as preliminary findings were presented. The room fell silent as security footage played on a large screen showing Officer Miller's interactions with General Washington from multiple angles. The contrast between her treatment of the general and her cursory processing of white visitors was stark and undeniable when viewed in sequence. The governor winced visibly at particularly damning moments, Miller's hand moving to her weapon as Washington reached for his identification, her smirk as she loudly questioned his credentials, the excessive force used during handcuffing, while Washington offered no resistance. When the footage ended, the governor cleared his throat. "General Washington, on behalf of the state of Alabama, I offer my deepest apologies for the inexcusable treatment you received today. I assure you that Officer Miller's actions do not reflect our values or protocols." Washington nodded acknowledgement, but offered no immediate absolution. "Governor, I appreciate your personal involvement. However, I'm more concerned with the systemic issues this incident reveals than with one officer's behavior." He gestured to a military aide who distributed folders to everyone at the table. "These contain 57 documented complaints of racial profiling by security personnel in this building over the past 3 years. Only 4 received formal investigation. None resulted in disciplinary action." The governor's face flushed as he scanned the documents. "I was unaware of this pattern. This is deeply troubling." "Indeed," Washington agreed, "which brings us to the critical question. Is Officer Miller's conduct today an aberration or a symptom of institutional tolerance for discriminatory practices?" The building's head of security shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "General, while these statistics are concerning, many of these complaints lacked substantiating evidence. Officer Miller has been with us for 7 years with an otherwise exemplary record." "Exemplary," interrupted a black state representative who had joined the meeting. "My office has received numerous constituent complaints about Officer Miller specifically. My own administrative assistant was detained for 40 minutes last month, despite having proper credentials." The security chief appeared taken aback. "No official complaint was filed in that instance." "Because," the representative countered, "my assistant feared retaliation. The complaint system requires filing with the same security department that employs Officer Miller." General Washington raised a hand, quieting the growing tension. "This illustrates precisely why we need independent oversight of security practices. When accountability systems are controlled by the same authorities they're meant to check, they rarely function effectively." In a smaller room nearby, Officer Miller sat with her union representative and a department attorney. Her initial defiance had crumbled as she watched the security footage of her own behavior played back. The racial nature of her actions, so easily rationalized in the moment as security protocols, appeared glaringly obvious when viewed objectively. "What am I looking at here?" she asked quietly. "Termination? Criminal charges?" The attorney sighed heavily. "It's complicated. The evidence of discriminatory treatment is substantial. Depending on how General Washington chooses to proceed, this could range from departmental discipline to federal civil rights charges." "He's going to make an example of me," Miller said bitterly. "Some big public spectacle." The union representative shook his head. "Actually, that's not the impression I'm getting. From what I'm hearing, the general seems more focused on systemic reform than personal retribution." Back in the main conference room, Washington was indeed outlining a broader vision. "Governor, I propose establishing an independent civilian review board for all security operations in state buildings. Members should represent the diversity of Alabama's population and have real authority to investigate complaints and recommend disciplinary actions." The governor, eager to demonstrate responsiveness, nodded quickly. "I can issue an executive order establishing such a board immediately." "Additionally," Washington continued, "mandatory bias training for all security personnel should be implemented, with regular refresher courses and performance evaluations that specifically measure equitable treatment." As the meeting progressed, media presence outside the building grew. Journalists from local stations had been joined by national networks, all eager for statements from the general or footage of Officer Miller. Social media was already ablaze with partial video captured by witnesses, alongside hashtags demanding justice and accountability. The building's public affairs officer entered the conference room and whispered urgently to the governor, who then addressed General Washington. "Sir, there's significant media interest in this incident. They're requesting statements from both you and Officer Miller. How would you like to proceed?" Washington considered for a moment. "I have no interest in inflaming public sentiment against Officer Miller or this institution. However, transparency is essential for accountability. I propose a joint statement, focusing on the constructive measures being implemented rather than punitive actions." This measured response surprised many in the room who had expected righteous anger from a man so publicly humiliated. Instead, they witnessed strategic leadership, using an incident of personal injustice as leverage for institutional improvement. The governor readily agreed to Washington's approach, recognizing both its moral high ground and political wisdom. When the meeting concluded, General Washington requested a private conversation with the head of Human Resources. "I'd like to speak with Officer Miller directly," he said. "Not for a public confrontation, but a personal conversation." The HR director appeared concerned. "Sir, given the legal implications, that might not be advisable. Her union representative would certainly object." "This isn't about legal proceedings," Washington clarified. "It's about human understanding. Sometimes accountability requires looking someone in the eye and speaking truth to them directly. It's not about punishment, it's about growth." After some discussion, arrangements were made for a private meeting, scheduled for the following morning. As Washington finally left the building that evening, escorted by military police, he passed through the same atrium where he had been led in handcuffs hours earlier. Now employees stopped to applaud spontaneously, many with tears in their eyes. The elderly Korean War veteran who had questioned Officer Miller earlier approached cautiously. "General," he said, saluting sharply despite his civilian clothes, "I served with the 3rd Infantry in '52. Never thought I'd live to see a black man with 4 stars, but damned if you haven't made us all proud today." Washington returned the salute with equal respect. "The honor is mine, soldier. Men like you paved the way." This brief exchange, witnessed by dozens, embodied the day's transformation. From humiliation to honor, from bias to brotherhood, from discrimination to dignity. Do you believe there's enough accountability for discrimination in our society today? Comment number 1 if you think institutions need more independent oversight like General Washington proposed. Hit that like button if you admire how he maintained his dignity throughout this ordeal, and subscribe to see more stories of justice and transformation. What conversation do you think will unfold when General Washington meets privately with Officer Miller? Will she acknowledge her bias or continue to justify her actions? And what lessons might both of them learn from this confrontation? The most powerful moment of this remarkable story is yet to come. By sunrise the following morning, what had begun as a local incident of discrimination had metamorphosed into a national conversation about race, authority, and accountability. Major news networks displayed split-screen coverage. On one side, General Washington's distinguished military record and lifetime of service. On the other, statistics about racial profiling in government institutions across America. Social media exploded with hashtags like "Respect the Stars" and "Uniformed but Unequal." The Alabama State Administrative Center found itself an unwitting symbol in a much larger narrative about who belongs in positions of power and who faces scrutiny despite their credentials. Inside his hotel suite, General Washington sipped coffee while reviewing media coverage on a tablet. Unlike Officer Miller, whose name and face were being plastered across broadcasts despite official attempts to protect her identity, Washington had declined all interview requests. His military aide entered with an update. "Sir, the Pentagon has issued a statement supporting you and condemning the incident. The Secretary of Defense has personally requested a briefing." Washington nodded. Schedule it for tomorrow after I return to D.C. What about the Veterans Initiative? Director Harmon processed everything yesterday afternoon, sir. The program has received emergency approval and implementation begins next week. They're calling it the Washington Protocol. Unofficially. A rare smile crossed the general's face. That's the best news I've heard since this began. Meanwhile, at the administrative center, a different scene unfolded. Protesters had gathered outside, a diverse group carrying signs demanding accountability and systemic change. Military veterans formed a particularly visible contingent, many in uniform with signs reading, "Respect all who serve," and "We stand with General Washington." The building's security protocols had been temporarily overhauled overnight. State troopers had replaced the regular security staff at entrances, and visitors received apologetic, almost deferential treatment regardless of race. Inside, employees whispered about Officer Miller's fate and speculated about the upcoming meeting between her and General Washington. "I heard she's going to be fired publicly as an example," one administrative assistant told her colleagues in the break room. "No way," countered another. "The union would never allow that. Besides, she's not the only one who profiles people. She's just the one who got caught targeting someone powerful enough to fight back." In a conference room on the third floor, a hastily assembled task force of state officials, civil rights leaders, and military representatives drafted new security protocols. "The issue isn't just individual bias," explained Dr. Elaine Johnson, a professor of African American Studies from Tuskegee University who had been invited to consult. "It's about systems that enable bias to operate unchecked. When Officer Miller detained General Washington, she did so believing the system would support her actions, because historically it has." The task force's preliminary recommendations were ambitious: independent civilian oversight boards, mandatory body cameras for all security personnel, anonymous complaint systems with third-party investigation, and comprehensive bias training implemented not as a one-time event, but as ongoing professional development. "General Washington has given us a rare opportunity," noted the state's Deputy Attorney General. "High-profile incidents like this create momentum for reforms that might otherwise take years to implement." As noon approached, news vans continued to arrive outside the building. The scheduled meeting between Washington and Miller had somehow leaked to the press despite attempts at confidentiality. Journalists speculated about the confrontation to come, many framing it as a moment of reckoning for a biased officer. None predicted what would actually transpire. In a small private conference room secured by military police, Officer Miller waited nervously. Her union representative had advised against the meeting, warning that anything she said could be used in potential disciplinary or legal proceedings. But Miller had insisted. "I need to face this," she had told him, "one way or another." When General Washington entered, alone and without the military entourage that had surrounded him since the incident, Miller stood automatically at attention, a reflexive response to his uniform and rank. Washington gestured for her to sit and took a chair across from her, not at the head of the table as protocol might dictate, but directly opposite, establishing a conversational rather than hierarchical dynamic. "Officer Miller," he began, his deep voice measured and calm, "I want to thank you for agreeing to this meeting." Miller blinked in surprise at the courteous opening. "I didn't expect to have a choice, sir." "We always have choices," Washington replied. "Yesterday you chose to treat me as a threat rather than a visitor. Today I'm choosing to speak with you as one person to another, rather than through lawyers or public statements." The direct reference to yesterday's events caused Miller to look down at the table. "I was following security protocols for suspicious behavior," she said, the defense sounding hollow even to her own ears. "Were you?" Washington asked, not accusingly but with genuine curiosity. "Let's examine that. What specific behaviors triggered your suspicion when I entered the building?" Miller struggled to formulate an answer that didn't explicitly reference race. Her confidence seemed unusual. Most visitors show some uncertainty when entering a government building. Washington nodded thoughtfully. "So confidence was suspicious. Would you apply that standard equally to all visitors regardless of appearance?" The question hung in the air, Impossible to answer honestly without self-indictment. "Officer Miller," Washington continued when she remained silent, "I didn't request this meeting to extract an admission or apology. I wanted to understand the thinking that led to yesterday's events, because without understanding, meaningful change rarely occurs." Something in his tone, the absence of condemnation, gave Miller courage to speak more honestly. "When I saw you enter, something just felt wrong, out of place. So I can't explain it better than that. It was instinct. That's what we call implicit bias," Washington said gently. "The feeling that something is wrong or out of place when the only real anomaly is seeing a black man in a position of authority." To Miller's surprise, Washington shared a personal story. "When I received my first star as a brigadier general, I attended a military function with other flag officers. A white server approached me 3 times to take my coat or ask for my drink. Order, assuming I was waitstaff despite my uniform. His instinct told him I didn't belong among the other generals." Miller found herself nodding in reluctant understanding. "I never thought of myself as prejudiced," she admitted quietly. "My father was military. He served with black soldiers. Respected them. Which brings me to something I learned during the investigation," Washington said. "Your father was Master Sergeant Robert Miller, 82nd Airborne." Miller looked up in shock. "Yes. How did you know that?" "Because I was his commanding officer during Operation Desert Storm." The revelation landed like a thunderbolt. Miller's face registered disbelief, then shock, as she processed the implications. "That's impossible. My father would have mentioned serving under a black general." "Not a general then," Washington clarified. "I was a major, but I remember Sergeant Miller well. Excellent non-commissioned officer. Treated every soldier with equal respect regardless of background. He saved 3 men during an enemy engagement near Al-Basra." Tears welled in Miller's eyes. "That sounds like him. He never talked much about his service, but he had a Bronze Star." "Which I recommended him for," Washington added quietly. The connection between them, unexpected and profound, transformed the atmosphere in the room. Miller was no longer facing an abstract symbol of authority, but a human being connected to her own history and family legacy. "He died 3 years ago," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "Cancer." "I'm sorry to hear that," Washington replied with genuine sympathy. "Based on the man I knew, I think he would be troubled by what happened yesterday." Miller nodded slowly, tears now falling freely. "He would be ashamed of me." "Perhaps," Washington agreed, "but I also believe he would want this to become a moment of growth, rather than merely punishment." Their conversation continued for nearly an hour, ranging from personal experiences to broader social patterns. Washington shared stories of discrimination he had faced throughout his career, each overcome with dignity rather than bitterness. Miller gradually opened up about the security culture that rewarded hypervigilance and the subtle ways racial profiling had become normalized within institutional practices. When they finally emerged from the conference room, neither spoke to waiting officials about the content of their discussion. But observers noted something had clearly shifted. Miller's defensive posture had softened. Washington's formal military bearing included a new element of compassionate understanding. The private conversation between these 2 individuals, one with power derived from rank and moral authority, the other facing the consequences of misused authority, would remain largely private. But its effects would ripple outward in the days and weeks to come, transforming not just policies and protocols, but attitudes and assumptions throughout the system. What had begun as a moment of injustice was evolving into something more profound. An opportunity for institutional and personal transformation that extended far beyond one building in Alabama or one incident of discrimination. The wider implications were just beginning to unfold. The afternoon following General Washington's private meeting with Officer Miller brought unexpected developments. Rather than the public termination many had anticipated, the governor's office announced that Miller had been placed on administrative leave pending completion of bias assessment and specialized training. More surprisingly, a joint statement indicated that General Washington would participate in developing this training program, sharing his personal experiences to help security personnel recognize and address implicit bias. This unconventional resolution sparked intense debate. Civil rights activists criticized it as too lenient, arguing that Miller's actions warranted immediate dismissal. Law enforcement organizations defended the approach as constructive rather than punitive. Military veterans generally supported Washington's decision, recognizing in it the leadership philosophy that had earned him 4 stars, accountability balanced with opportunity for growth. As these public conversations swirled, a more personal confrontation unfolded away from cameras and microphones. Officer Miller sat alone in her apartment, surrounded by family photographs, including several of her father in military uniform. The Bronze Star he had earned under then Major Washington's command held pride of place on the mantel. She picked it up, running her fingers over its surface as though seeking guidance from the parent who had taught her to respect authority and treat people fairly, principles she had betrayed so thoroughly. Her phone had been ringing constantly. Colleagues, friends, even journalists somehow obtaining her number. She had stopped answering, overwhelmed by shame and confusion. The doorbell's sudden chime startled her. Through the peephole, she saw a middle-aged black woman in civilian clothes, standing patiently with a manila envelope. Miller opened the door cautiously. "Rebecca Miller," the woman asked. "I'm Dr. Patricia Washington, General Washington's wife. May I come in?" Stunned by this unexpected visitor, Miller stepped aside wordlessly. Dr. Washington entered with calm confidence, surveying the apartment with interest rather than judgment. "My husband told me about your conversation," she said, taking a seat when Miller gestured toward the couch. "He also mentioned the connection with your father." Miller remained standing, unsure how to respond to this surreal development. "Why are you here?" she finally managed. "The general already said everything that needed saying." Dr. Washington smiled gently. Marcus shared his perspective as a military officer and the target of discrimination. "I thought you might benefit from hearing from a black woman who has spent her career studying the psychology of bias and reconciliation." She placed the envelope on the coffee table. "I'm a professor of social psychology at Howard University. These are some resources I've developed for people confronting their own implicit biases." Miller sank into a chair opposite her unexpected guest. "With all due respect, Dr. Washington, why would you want to help me? I humiliated your husband in public based on nothing but the color of his skin." "That's precisely why," Dr. Washington replied. "Because you're now at a crossroads. You can become defensive, bitter, and entrenched in your biases, or you can use this painful experience as a catalyst for genuine transformation." She leaned forward slightly. "Rebecca, may I call you Rebecca? My husband believes you're capable of the latter. I'm here because I share that belief." What followed was a conversation unlike any Miller had experienced, direct yet compassionate, challenging yet supportive. Dr. Washington neither excused Miller's actions nor condemned her character. Instead, she created space for Miller to confront uncomfortable truths about herself and the culture that had shaped her perceptions. "The hardest part," Miller admitted after nearly an hour of conversation, "is reconciling who I thought I was with what I actually did. I've always seen myself as fair-minded. I have black colleagues I respect. I never used racial slurs or joined in when others made explicit racist comments." "That's common," Dr. Washington explained. "Most discrimination today isn't driven by overt hatred, but by unconscious associations and assumptions. You didn't detain Marcus because you hate black people. You detained him because something in your mental framework couldn't reconcile blackness with 4-star military authority." Miller nodded slowly, the psychological framework helping her understand her actions without excusing them. "So what do I do now? How do I fix this, not just for my job, but for myself?" Dr. Washington opened the envelope and spread several articles and workbooks on the coffee table. "It starts with awareness, continues with education, and requires ongoing practice. Overcoming bias isn't a destination, it's a lifelong journey." As evening approached, Dr. Washington prepared to leave. At the door, she handed Miller a business card. "Call me if you need to talk further. This won't be easy, especially as the public scrutiny continues." Miller took the card with trembling fingers. "Why are you being so kind to me? I don't deserve this generosity." Dr. Washington's expression grew serious. "This isn't about what you deserve. It's about what's necessary for healing, yours and our societies. Marcus and I have had to decide many times whether to respond to discrimination with righteous anger or transformative engagement. Both have their place, but in your case, we see an opportunity for something beyond punishment." As Dr. Washington departed, Miller returned to her living room and began reading the materials she'd been given. One article described how confronting bias required moving through stages of defensiveness, shame, acceptance, and eventually committed action. She recognized herself in the early stages of this journey, with a long road ahead. Meanwhile, across town, the Washingtons shared dinner in their hotel suite, discussing the day's events. "How was she?" the general asked. "Shaken," his wife replied. "Confused, but receptive. There's potential there if she's willing to do the work." Washington nodded thoughtfully. "The governor wants to create a statewide training program using this incident as a case study. He suggested having both Miller and me participate as instructors once she completes her own education process." Dr. Washington considered this. "That would be powerful, the two of you teaching together, showing a journey from confrontation to collaboration, but only if her transformation is genuine, not performative." "Agreed," the general said. "Time will tell." As they continued their meal, news alerts appeared on their phones. The story had gone national, with commentators across the political spectrum weighing in. Many praised Washington's measured response as exemplary leadership. Others criticized it as too forgiving of inexcusable behavior. Some questioned whether a white officer would face harsher consequences for detaining a white general, highlighting the double standard that often requires black Americans to be magnanimous in the face of discrimination. The Washingtons largely ignored the noise, focusing instead on the human dimension of the unfolding situation. They had witnessed too many cycles of outrage that produced heat without light, condemnation without change. Their approach, while perhaps unsatisfying to those seeking punitive justice, aimed for something more lasting: transformation at both personal and institutional levels. Back in her apartment, Officer Miller finally answered a call from her supervisor requesting her presence at a department meeting the following morning to discuss next steps. Her instinct was to resign immediately rather than face her colleague's judgment, but something in Dr. Washington's words about the importance of moving through discomfort rather than avoiding it gave her pause. Perhaps the more difficult path, confronting her actions publicly and committing to change openly, was exactly what was needed, not just for her career, but for her integrity. As night fell across Alabama, these two households, connected by an incident of discrimination but now linked by something more complex, prepared in their separate ways for the challenges ahead. The personal confrontations, Miller with her own biases, Washington with the recurring indignities of racism, both with the imperfect systems they served, had only just begun. But in these private reckonings lay the seeds of public transformation, the potential for individual growth to catalyze institutional change. The next day would bring new tests and opportunities as the story continued to unfold, touching lives far beyond those directly involved in the original incident. 1 year later, the Alabama State Administrative Center buzzed with activity as officials, military personnel, and community leaders gathered for an unprecedented ceremony. Banners proclaiming Inaugural Washington Protocol Training Academy adorned the same atrium where General Marcus Washington had once been led away in handcuffs. The incident that might have ended with bitter recriminations or hollow apologies had instead spawned something revolutionary: a comprehensive program for addressing bias in public institutions that was being adopted by government agencies across the country. General Washington, now retired from active military service but busier than ever, stood at the podium surveying the diverse audience. Beside him stood Rebecca Miller, no longer a security officer, but the Academy's Deputy Director for Curriculum Development. Their unlikely partnership had become a powerful symbol of transformative justice in action. 1 year ago in this building, Washington began, his deep voice carrying without need of amplification. A moment of injustice created an opportunity for transformation. Today, we celebrate not just what we've built from that difficult beginning, but what it represents for our ongoing national conversation about race, authority, and accountability. The audience included the governor, state legislators, federal officials, and most significantly, security personnel from government buildings throughout Alabama. The first cohort to complete the intensive training program that would now be mandatory for all public safety officers in state facilities. Washington continued. The Washington Protocol isn't about avoiding lawsuits or public relations damage. It's about fundamentally reimagining how authority is exercised in public spaces. It's about creating systems where dignity is the default, not the exception. He gestured to Miller, inviting her to join him at the microphone. Her transformation over the past year had been remarkable. The defensive, biased officer had evolved into a thoughtful advocate for equitable security practices, using her own painful journey as a teaching tool. "When I detained General Washington that day," Miller acknowledged, facing the audience with hard-won composure, "I believed I was following security protocols. What I've learned since then is how those protocols themselves were built on foundations of bias, and how my unexamined assumptions made me an instrument of discrimination rather than public service." The ceremony marked the culmination of an extraordinary year. Following the incident, General Washington had shocked many by declining to pursue personal legal action against Miller or the state. Instead, he had proposed an alternative form of accountability, the creation of a comprehensive bias reduction program that would address root causes rather than merely punish symptoms. The governor, recognizing both the moral wisdom and political advantage of this approach, had committed unprecedented resources to the initiative. What emerged was multifaceted: an independent civilian oversight board for security operations in all state buildings, mandatory body cameras and regular review of security interactions, a reformed complaint system administered by a third-party civil rights organization, and most significantly, the training academy itself, where security personnel underwent immersive experiences designed to reveal and address implicit bias. The program's most innovative aspect was its leadership structure, which paired former offenders who had demonstrated genuine commitment to change with those who had experienced discrimination. Miller was not the only security officer involved. Several others who had faced complaints had chosen the difficult path of public accountability and growth rather than resignation or denial. As the ceremony continued, Dr. Patricia Washington joined her husband and Miller at the podium. Her psychological expertise had been instrumental in designing curriculum that moved beyond superficial sensitivity training to address deeper cognitive and institutional patterns. "What makes this program different," she explained, "is that it doesn't treat bias as simply a matter of individual prejudice. It recognizes that discrimination operates at multiple levels: personal, interpersonal, institutional, and structural. Effective intervention requires addressing all these dimensions simultaneously." The audience included some who had initially criticized Washington's approach as too lenient toward Miller. Many had come to recognize that the transformative model, while perhaps less immediately satisfying than punitive justice, produced more substantial and sustainable results. The statistics spoke for themselves. Complaints of discriminatory treatment in state buildings had decreased by 68% in departments that had implemented the protocol. But the ceremony's most powerful moment came when an elderly black veteran approached the microphone during the public comment period. With tears in his eyes, he described entering the administrative center that morning, the first time he had done so since witnessing General Washington's humiliation a year earlier. "The last time I was here," he said, his voice wavering with emotion, "I watched a 4-star general treated like a criminal because of his skin color. Today I was greeted with respect, asked about my service, and thanked for my contributions. That's the difference between checking a box on diversity training and actually transforming a culture." As the formal program concluded, attendees mingled in the atrium where the transformation had begun. Washington and Miller moved through the crowd together, their unlikely alliance a living demonstration of the principles they now taught. A young black lieutenant approached them hesitantly. General Washington, sir, I just wanted to say that watching how you handled this situation inspired me to stay in the service when I was considering leaving after experiencing discrimination in my unit. Washington clasped the young officer's shoulder. The uniform doesn't shield us from prejudice, Lieutenant, but it does give us a platform to create change when we encounter it. Remember that. Later, as the crowd thinned, Miller found herself alone with Washington for a moment. I never properly thanked you, she said quietly, not just for giving me a second chance, but for showing me a better way forward than I could have found on my own. Washington smiled. A mentor once told me that true leadership isn't about what you accomplish yourself. It's about what you inspire others to become. You've done the hard work here, Rebecca. I just opened a door. As they prepared to leave, a journalist approached for one final question. General Washington, did you know when you proposed this program that it would have such far-reaching impact? Washington's response revealed the truth that had been hidden, even from Miller until now. When I entered that building a year ago, I was carrying more than just paperwork for a veterans initiative. I was carrying the memory of a similar incident 20 years earlier, when as a junior officer, I was detained and humiliated in a government building in Georgia. Back then, I had no recourse, no platform, no authority to create change. He paused, the weight of that memory visible in his expression. So yes, when I found myself in a position of sufficient authority to transform such an incident into institutional change rather than merely personal vindication, I recognized the opportunity immediately. I had been preparing for that moment for decades. This revelation, that Washington had experienced such discrimination before and had been strategically planning how to address it systemically when the opportunity arose, added a new dimension to the story. What had seemed like an enlightened response to a single incident was revealed as part of a long-term vision for institutional transformation. As Washington and Miller exited the building side by side, the decorated general and the former officer, now partners in an unexpected mission, they embodied the principle at the heart of transformative justice, that even the deepest wounds can become openings for healing when approached with wisdom and courage. Behind them, the newly trained security personnel took their positions, committed to ensuring that dignity would indeed become the default, rather than the exception for every person who entered the building, regardless of rank, title, or appearance. The Washington Protocol had begun as one man's response to personal humiliation. It was evolving into nothing less than a reimagining of how authority could be exercised in a society still wrestling with the legacy of bias. Its success would ultimately be measured not in ceremonies or statistics, but in the thousands of discriminatory encounters that would never happen because of the changes it inspired. Have you ever witnessed discrimination transform into an opportunity for positive change? This incredible story shows how dignity and leadership can turn injustice into progress. Comment below if you believe we need more approaches like the Washington Protocol in our institutions today. Like this video if you found inspiration in General Washington's strategic vision for change rather than revenge, and subscribe to join our community dedicated to sharing stories that challenge our perspectives and inspire action. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that true accountability isn't just about punishment, it's about transformation. Thank you for watching this remarkable journey from humiliation to healing, from confrontation to collaboration. Remember that each of us has the power to respond to prejudice, not just with righteous anger, but with the kind of wisdom that creates lasting change. This powerful story teaches us that true dignity isn't the absence of discrimination, but how we respond to it. General Washington demonstrated that leadership means transforming personal injustice into systemic change rather than seeking revenge. His approach reveals that accountability doesn't require punishment, it demands growth. By choosing transformative justice over punitive measures, he created lasting institutional change instead of temporary satisfaction. The story also illuminates how bias operates at multiple levels. Personal assumptions, institutional policies, and cultural norms all contributed to Officer Miller's actions. Meaningful change requires addressing all these dimensions simultaneously. Perhaps most importantly, this narrative challenges us to examine our own implicit biases. Like Officer Miller, many of us carry unconscious associations that influence our behavior despite our conscious beliefs. True growth begins with the humility to acknowledge these biases and the courage to confront them. Finally, the Washington Protocol demonstrates that reconciliation isn't about forgetting injustice. It's about channeling righteous anger into constructive action. By partnering with his former antagonist, General Washington created something more powerful than either could have accomplished alone. A blueprint for institutional transformation that honors both accountability and human dignity. Has this story changed how you think about addressing discrimination in your own life? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found inspiration in General Washington's approach to transformative justice, please hit that like button. Subscribe to join our community dedicated to sharing powerful stories of dignity and change. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that true leadership transforms wounds into wisdom. Thank you for witnessing this journey from humiliation to healing. May we all find the courage to confront bias with both accountability and compassion.